Stories, Philippines, podcast.
A darkness permeates this episode, touching on scenes and themes some may find deeply unsettling. Listener discretion is a necessity. The heat was a living thing, thick and sweet with a smell of scorched earth and old dark molasses. It clung to the back of the throat, tasting like 1,000 forgotten promises and 100 new sins. Imagine standing in a field that stretches to the horizon, not green and vibrant but stubbled, brown and waiting for the rain, waiting for the harvest, waiting for something to give way. But this waiting has an edge to it. It is not the patient pause of nature. It is the tense, angry silence of a man holding his breath before an inevitable scream. In the dead center of the Philippines' main island of Luzon, in Tarlac province, the land itself remembers a sweetness, a terrifying wealth built on the backs of those who worked the cane. Sugarcane, a simple crop, a source of global delight. But here, the simple stalk has been soaked in something far more potent than its own sugary juice. It is saturated with history, with ownership, and with blood. In a particular terrible violence occurred here, not in the distant past of Spanish galleons or Japanese occupation, but in the glaring, unforgettable light of the early 21st century. An explosion of desperation in an ocean of silence. Think of the sound of a machete slicing through the air. Not the clean, professional sound of a harvest, but a desperate, heavy thud. Think of the taste of dust and tears mingled on a dry tongue. The feel of the sun on your neck after standing still for days. This is the stage, this is the setting, a place where the earth is not just a provider, but a witness, a very angry witness. It is a story not just of ghosts walking the cane rows, but of the very real, very human terror of absolute power and profound hunger. I am Paul, and you are listening to Stories Philippines podcast. The Hacienda Lucita Estate is not just a place, it is a concept. It is a piece of land that has seen over 5 decades of political wrangling, of promises made and promises broken, all surrounding the simple, elemental desire of a man to own the ground he stands on. It is a name that whispers of a certain powerful family whose lineage is woven into the very fabric of the nation's history. From the 1980s onward, the simmering discontent over the land's ownership and the workers' share of its bounty was a low, constant rumble beneath the surface of the national consciousness. But in the year 2004, that rumble broke through, becoming a devastating earthquake of violence that still shakes the conscience of the country. The story is one of agrarian reform, an idea that sounds dry and academic on paper, but in reality is a matter of life and death. The workers, the sakaras, who toiled in the fields from dawn until dusk, generation after generation felt they were owed a piece of the pie, a sliver of the actual land itself. They demanded a better deal. They went on strike, and the owners with the backing of state forces resisted. This is the old global tale of the landlord and the peasant, a horror story found in the feudal manners of Europe, the cotton plantations of the American South, and the vast sugar tracts of this Philippine soil. The pattern is tragically identical. Wealth demands submission, and resistance is met with overwhelming, brutal force. The moment came in the month of November 2004. It was not a hidden attack in the dead of night. It was a terrifying public confrontation at the gates of the hacienda. The workers, men and women, who simply asked for a better life and a piece of the land they worked, stood their ground. They were met by elements of the Philippine National Police and the military. There are claims and counterclaims, the kind of confusing, contradictory narratives that only arise when the powerful clash with the powerless. But the result is tragically clear: tear gas, water cannons, and then the unmistakable echoing sounds of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, several farmers and their supporters lay dead, not in a faraway war, but on the earth they had defended with their bodies. They were not combatants in a conventional sense. They were workers. They were fathers and mothers. Their names were etched onto the nation's memory as martyrs in a struggle for justice. Men like Jaron, who had only recently found the courage to speak up in the farmers' assemblies, now lay still beneath the cold glare of a national spotlight. It was a massacre, a stain on the land. And this is where the real haunting begins. In the lore of the Philippines, and indeed in the folklore of many countries where the earth is violently taken or lives are unjustly ended, the dead do not simply go. They become tethered. They become part of the very soil where their blood was spilled. It is a spiritual understanding that violence leaves an indelible trace, a psychic scar upon the landscape. The ancient Filipino belief in the duende, or the anito, is rooted in the idea that spirits of place or ancestors hold sway over the living. When those ancestors die in anger, in injustice, the consequences for the living can be severe and long-lasting. Consider the European notion of the genius loci, the protective spirit of a place. When that spirit is enraged by human violation, the land turns malevolent. Or think of the Native American belief that land is not property, but a sacred entity, and its desecration brings spiritual peril. The farmers who died in Luisita did not just leave behind grieving families, they left behind a palpable, angry energy. Their ghosts are not merely sad specters, but active, demanding forces. In the years that followed the killings, the reports began, faint at first, then growing into a persistent murmur, the kind of stories you can only hear if you are close to the land. The security guards hired to patrol the newly reinforced gates reported hearing voices in the cane fields at night. Not the sounds of animals or the wind, but human voices, shouting orders in a mixture of Tagalog and Kapampangan. The words were always the same. Calls for a meeting, demands for the papers, a cry of hold the line. The voices would materialize close by, sounding as clear as if 1,000 men were standing just beyond the fence. But when the guards shone their powerful flashlights, the field was empty. The sound would recede, a great disappointed sigh that carried the scent of burnt sugarcane. Smell is important. Sugarcane, when harvested, is often burned to remove the tough outer leaves before cutting. It is a common practice. But this smell, according to the local residents and former workers, was different. It was a smell that would spontaneously appear on clear, cool nights. The powerful, sickeningly sweet, heavy odor of cane burning in an area where no fire had been set. It would hang in the air like a thick, visible vapor, choking the throats of those who smelt it. This, they say, is the spiritual signature of the trauma. The smell of the industry that owned them, now haunted by the memory of their last breath. One farmer named Cristobal, whose brother was among those killed, recounts a story that is as much about grief as it is about the paranormal. After the incident, the local Catholic Church tried to perform rites of blessing and exorcism on the land, attempting to bring peace to the disturbed ground. But Cristobal says the efforts failed because the spirits did not want peace. They wanted justice. He described driving his beat-up tricycle past the main entrance one foggy night in the year 2000. He saw a shape, not a transparent sheet or a classic ghost, but a knot of dark figures standing on the road. They looked like the striking farmers, dressed in the simple, dusty clothes they wore for work. They were holding what looked like wooden sticks and placards. He slowed down, thinking it was a late-night protest that the media had missed. But as his headlights swept over them, the figures did not move. They did not react. They simply were. When he got closer, he realized he could see the trees through them. The image was perfectly rendered down to the dust on their shirts, but fundamentally non-existent in the physical sense. They were reenacting the protest. And as his vehicle passed, he heard a koida sound, shouted words, but a single, immense, echoing weep that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his tires. He never drove that road after sunset again. This phenomenon is not isolated. In the realm of paranormal investigation, there is a concept known as the stone tape theory. The idea suggests that certain emotionally charged events, moments of great violence, fear, or trauma, can leave an imprint on the environment itself, particularly on materials like stone, wood, or even the molecular structure of the earth. The location then acts like a recording device, playing back the event under certain atmospheric or energetic condition. This is a scientific and psychological attempt to explain residual hauntings, the ghosts that are not sentient but mere recordings of past suffering. In Hacienda Luisita, the land has become a colossal stone tape. The immense collective trauma of the confrontation, the desperation of the farmers, the terror of the moment the firing began, all burned an impression onto the earth. The figures seen reenacting the protest, the sudden smell of burning cane, the echoing shouts and cries are perhaps the land itself groaning under the weight of injustice, repeating the scene in an endless, sorrowful loop. The socio-political context adds a layer of dread that is far more unsettling than any supernatural fear. The real horror is the understanding that the structure of the land ownership remains largely intact, the grievances unresolved, and the powerful unpunished. The spirits of the dead are a constant physical reminder of a structural flaw in society. Their haunting is a political act. It is the refusal of the murdered to be forgotten and a demand for the justice that the living have thus far failed to provide. The land itself is demanding agrarian reform. This concept of political haunting is also seen globally. Think of the battlefields of Gettysburg in the United States, where figures in Civil War uniforms are reported to walk the fields, their mission unfinished. Or the sites of massacres during the Cambodian genocide, where witnesses speak of the ghosts of the victims, thin and demanding, their presence a constant pressure on the consciousness of the community. In all these places, the spirit world intersects with a profound human failing, turning a simple field or a forest into a perpetually charged, dangerous place. The dead are not just ghosts, they are perpetual protesters. A few years ago, a former overseer, a man named David, who had worked for the estate for many years and was present during the 2004 incident, became severely ill. He was a deeply religious man and he confessed to a local priest that his illness was a punishment. He was tormented, he said, not by devils but by the sight of the men who died. They would appear in his dreams, standing by his bed, not menacingly but with an immense accusatory sadness. They did not need to speak. Their presence was a rebuke. This confession highlights the theological insight into the haunting. In the Catholic tradition, the souls in purgatory are often understood to be suffering, seeking intercession to be released to heaven. But what if the suffering is not for their own sins, but for the sins committed against them? The farmers' souls, in this view, are not trapped by their own shortcomings, but are held fast by the injustice they suffered. The restlessness is a cry to the living to balance the scales. The haunting, therefore, is a spiritual obligation placed upon the community, an obligation to correct the wrong. Religious figures who have been close to the situation suggest that no amount of blessing will suffice until the demands of the dead are met in the physical world, justice, and land. The spiritual world in this case is not an escape from the material one, but a mirror reflecting its deepest flaw. The sheer scale of the estate adds to the geographic isolation and the feeling of dread. It is a huge, almost overwhelming expanse. Imagine driving for miles, surrounded only by tall, rustling stalks of sugarcane. It is a claustrophobic emptiness. The vastness allows for secrets to be kept and for small tragedies to go unnoticed. The sheer monotony of the landscape, the endless rows of green, or the endless stubble of brown creates a mental disorientation. It makes the mind vulnerable to suggestion. When you are alone in that landscape, the voices in the wind become the voices of the dead. The shadows stretching long under the tropical sun become the elongated, mournful shapes of the murdered farmers. It is in one of the far corners of the property, near a dilapidated shack that was once a staging area for the workers' tools, that the most personal and arguably most frightening encounters have occurred. A young agricultural student, Alan, who was doing research on the sugar harvest practices in the year 2010, was forced to stay overnight in the area due to his broken-down motorcycle. He was a skeptic, a science-minded young man who dismissed all the local talk as superstition. That night, he recorded his experiences in his field notebook. He wrote about the profound, unsettling silence, no birds, no insects, just the wind. Then, he described seeing a light in the shack, a small, flickering light like a gas lamp. He approached it, thinking it was a night watchman. As he got closer, he could hear the distinct sound of a conversation. It sounded like a planning meeting, the low murmur of men strategizing. He heard a man clearly say, "We must not give up the gate. This is for our children." Alan approached the window and peered in. The light source was a single candle on a makeshift table. Gathered around it were 6 men. They were thin, their faces lined with sun and worry. They were looking at a crude map drawn on a piece of cardboard. They were not transparent, they were solid. They looked real. Alan, relieved, was about to knock and ask for help when one of the men looked up. His eyes, Alan wrote, were not the eyes of a living man. They were black and held a depth of sorrow that seemed to drain the light from the air. The man smiled, a tight, terrible, knowing smile, and then he raised his hand, not to wave, but to point. He pointed at Alan, and then his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, to point at the ground directly beneath the student's feet. Alan, in a panic, ran. He didn't look back. When he was finally safe on the main road, he realized what he had seen. The faces of the men in the shack matched the old yellowed photographs of the farmers killed 6 years earlier. The man who pointed was the farmer named Jahan. His message was terrifyingly simple. This is where we belong now, beneath your feet. This is the psychological reality of collective trauma. When a group of people experience an immense shared horror, the fear and the stories become deeply embedded in the cultural memory. For the people who live and work near the hacienda, the ghost stories are not just tales for entertainment. They are a coping mechanism. They are a way to process the unimaginable cruelty and a way to ensure that the victim's cause is never forgotten. The ghost stories become a form of oral history, a tradition that preserves the truth when the official records may be intentionally confused or incomplete. It is a powerful parallel to the way people in other deeply scarred parts of the world cope with historical injustice. In the former Soviet bloc, for instance, stories of officials reappearing as spectral figures in government buildings or of victims' voices echoing in former prisons are common. These stories allow a generation to speak the truth that the state forbids them from saying openly. The Filipino folklore, blended with this very real tragedy, creates a narrative of resistance where the dead fight on the only plane left to them, the plane of the spirit. The deeper tragedy of Hacienda Luisita, the one that makes the blood-soaked earth a place of fear, is a realization that the haunting is an ongoing event. The legal battles over the land continue in the courts, an endless bureaucratic purgatory for the souls who died to claim it. The land remains a symbol of inequality, a physical embodiment of the vast, seemingly unbridgeable gap between the powerful few and the struggling many. The ghosts of the murdered farmers are not asking for a typical haunting. They are not after screams or cheap scares. They are demanding a resolution. Their restless energy is simply a reflection of the restless, unresolved case that continues to plague the nation. The scent of burnt sugarcane is the scent of an unfinished sacrifice. Until the land is finally truly given to the people who work it, until justice is rendered, the air of the hacienda will continue to carry the smell of smoke and the echoes of a protest that will never truly end. The horror is not just in the ghost you see, but in the injustice that created it. That is the darkest truth of all. If you have a story from the sugarcane fields or any place in the Philippines where history meets the spectral, submit your stories to our email, storiesphpodcast@gmail.com. Find show notes and support options including links to human rights organizations working on land justice issues in the Philippines in the description. Access exclusive content on Patreon for bonus interviews and behind-the-scenes looks at our research. Follow us on social media for daily folklore facts. What does it truly mean for a man to own the ground beneath his feet, and what terrible price is paid when that ownership is denied? Does the earth itself have a memory, a conscience that refuses to be silenced? The poet and activist Louis Chosin wrote, "The seed knows its soil. It remembers the taste of the first blood that watered it." Do not forget to like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast. Support the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes. The ghosts of Hacienda Luisita are not confined to the unseen. They are there in the soil, in the smoke, in every whisper that rises from the rustling cane, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried nor it germinates. It grows, and when justice is denied, even the land learns to speak. Perhaps that's the real horror here, not the apparitions that haunt the fields, but the truth that we've learned to live alongside them. We call them legends to make them easier to swallow. But they are not myths, they are memories. And memories demand remembrance. So the next time you pass a quiet stretch of farmland beneath the sweltering sun, and the air smells faintly of burnt sugar, listen carefully. You might just hear the voices that refuse to fade, echoing through the rows, still calling for justice, still holding the line. I'm Paul, and this has been Stories Philippines podcast. Thank you for listening to this premiere episode of Season 2. If these stories moved you, share them, not just to spread fear, but to keep memory alive. Because here in the Philippines, even the land remembers.